Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much to Haymarket Book for hosting tonight's conversation on criminalization at the core of authoritarianism, fascism, and resistance. My name is Andrea Ritchie. I am a very light-skinned Black woman with glasses and curly hair, wearing a black shirt in a living room, and I am a co-founder of Interrupting Criminalization. And tonight's conversation is one that Interrupting Criminalization has been having and wanting to have in many different iterations and configurations since last November. And so we're so grateful to all of you for joining us tonight, and to our panelists for being part of tonight's conversation. And I just wanted to start off by sort of explaining a little bit what criminalization means to us at Interrupting Criminalization. It's process that extends far beyond enactment and enforcement of criminal laws and policies to really practices of policing and punishment by the state, institutions, and individuals. And really, we understand it as a political process that creates groups of inherently criminalized kind of others for whom rights don't exist in reality because they are framed as existential threats who need to be violently controlled and punished and removed. And that process definitely manifests itself and is enacted through criminal laws, as well as civil and administrative laws and policies and policing. But as we have shown in this image on this slide, it's also shaped and undergirded by impulses to scapegoat and punish. And oh, here comes the slide. The next slide, please. So yeah, we understand that criminalization, oh no, that's maybe not where we are. All right, we'll drop the slides and just move to the conversation. Thanks, Sean. Sorry, that didn't quite work out. But yes, criminalization, we understand it as a political process that is shaped and undergirded by impulses really to scapegoat and punish, and by criminalizing narratives and practices that are really central to the operation of white supremacy, cis-heteropatriarchy, and imperialism, all of which obviously fuel authoritarianism and fascism. And really, laws and policies are just the tip of the iceberg. Virtually every institution of society engages in criminalization, from police to schools to universities to healthcare to social services. And in fact, criminalization is a process that all of us participate in, at least to some degree. And under any political regime, criminalization is a process that normalizes and legitimizes a certain level of violence, and also of denial of care and the necessities for survival to targeted groups, whether that's the violence of family separation, solitary confinement and deprivation in prisons, the violence of policing, or the violence of just denying care to undocumented migrants, to pregnant people, to disabled people, trans people, or the violence of denying access to information or to community or to spaces of learning. And criminalization really prepares the way and creates the infrastructure for exponential expansion and escalation of all these forms of violence under authoritarianism and fascism, as we're currently seeing on so many fronts. As Rachel Herzing, who we're privileged to be joined by tonight, and her co-authors explain in an article that I hope Sean will drop in the chat on prison abolition and fascism, fascism requires the machinery and the legitimacy of the prison industrial complex to function. And it's important to recognize that the connection between criminalization, authoritarianism, and fascism isn't limited to the use of the prison industrial complex to suppress dissent and target adversaries. Criminalization is literally at the core of how fascism and authoritarianism operate. It creates and expands categories of enemies within who threaten an existing, desired, or imagined racist, sexist, ableist, homophobic, transphobic, imperialist, and capitalist social order, and who therefore must be contained and caged and ultimately eliminated and eradicated. In other words, criminalization is the process of creating an us and a them, as Scot Nakagawa, who's joining us tonight, and so many other scholars of authoritarianism and fascism have described it. Or as Ajaris Dixon, who's joining us tonight, has described it, the decitizenizing of people. Criminalization is the process of dehumanizing and labeling all Palestinians, from newborns to centenarians, as so-called terrorists whose dehumanization is complete and whose existence must be eliminated by genocide. Criminalization is what drives the process of enslavement, extraction, and displacement that characterizes colonization of this continent, the African continent, and beyond. All of these processes are ultimately processes of criminalization, and therefore criminalization must be at the core of our resistance to right-wing, fascist, and authoritarian regimes and agendas. And that's why we founded Interrupting Criminalization during the first iteration of the current administration. And the images I was going to show on the slides are contained in a report called The Crisis of Criminalization that we put out in 2017 that I hope Sean will drop in the chat, because we understand that criminalization is central to and instrumental to enabling, enacting, and enforcing right-wing authoritarian and fascist agendas, movements, and regimes. It's literally how they operate, how they're legitimized, how they manufacture consent by manufacturing threats and fomenting fear. And therefore, tonight's conversation is an effort to understand, confronting, and challenging criminalization as essential to striking at the heart of fascism that we're living in this moment, to make sense of this moment through the lens of criminalization, and to hammer home the importance of not just focusing on discrete arenas of criminalization, the repression of dissent, or abortion, or criminalization of abortion, or of trans healthcare, but to really understand criminalization, broadly speaking, as the route on which we need to pull with all of our might across our movements to resist fascism and authoritarianism. So with that, I will bring in this incredible group of panelists. Rather than read their bios, which would not do them justice, or describe all the ways in which I admire them, which would also not do them justice, I'll invite them to describe and introduce themselves. We'll drop the links to their bios, or the information of their bios, in the chat, and a link to their organizations, and then we'll just jump in. And I'm going to start with Scot, who's, if you're not already subscribed to the Anti-Authoritarian Playbook newsletter, I really encourage you to get on that right now and read it every morning. It'll give you clear analysis, clear sense-making, and clear ways to fight. So I'm just going to ask Scot to introduce himself and just really sort of state the ways in which you see the role that you see criminalization has in advancing and legitimizing authoritarianism and fascism, kind of briefly, and then we'll dive into it as we continue the conversation.
Okay, well, excuse me. First of all, I have to tell you, I have a cold, and so if I start to run out of voice and become quiet, you will be in very good hands, because there are very great people on this panel, but that might happen. My name is Scot Nakagawa. I am the executive director of the 22nd Century Initiative. The 22nd Century Initiative was co-founded by me and an activist named Ritchie that some of you may know. And it was created in order to function as a national action and strategy lab in the effort to prevent the further mainstreaming of authoritarianism and to build upon the democratic potential of the United States, efforts that we see as deeply intertwined. We believe that the effort to defeat authoritarianism will help us to build the kind of democratic muscle we need to advance the democracy we want going into the 22nd century. So that's basically who I am. My background on these issues goes back quite a long way. I came by this work honestly working with people who are victimized by sexual assault and child abuse, and recognize the role that authoritarian norms play in those forms of abuse and the kinds of hierarchies that make it difficult for that kind of abuse to get addressed. But then that understanding evolved in 1988 when in Portland, Oregon, a young man named Mulugeta Sarah, an Ethiopian immigrant, was murdered by neo-Nazi skinheads. I became part of the mobilization to address that effort and establish a statewide organization there that eventually evolved into a 5-state Northwest organization called the Coalition for Human Dignity. And so I've been kind of on this trail looking at this phenomena for quite some time. And I have to admit, I could not have imagined this particular iteration until perhaps the last 7 or 8 years. That said, I don't think they could have either, and that the authoritarians could have either. So, I think that Andrea really covered a lot of the ground in terms of, where we're at around the relationship of the development of carceral state and the rise of authoritarianism. Authoritarians do, in fact, rely on that kind of infrastructure in order to be able to achieve their ends. And I think that we should be understanding the development of the prison industrial complex as basically creating the means by which authoritarians can actually consolidate power and hold it in a multi-ethnic and very complex state, right? In which a majority of people actually oppose authoritarianism, oppose political violence, and oppose what we see happening in this administrative coup that we are presently in. So I can stop there because I know there are going to be some more questions and I'm anxious to hear from other people, but we can get more specific as we go along.
Thank you so much, Scott. I'm going to go from you to Rachel Herzing, who's been one of my abolitionist teachers for over a quarter century now, and who wrote an incredible article sort of laying out what you were saying about the infrastructure of the PIC being essential to authoritarianism, co-authored an article. So go ahead, Rachel.
Thank you, Andrea, and I'm really grateful to be with this collection of smart people tonight talking about something that feels really urgent, so appreciate the invitation here. As Andrea said, my name is Rachel Herzing. I come to this conversation tonight, I am guessing mostly because of my work in fighting criminalization, fighting the prison industrial complex. I've been organizing for the abolition of the prison industrial complex since the late 90s and have really benefited from working in lots of different formations, but my main place has been critical resistance, and I know you'll hear more about them a little later, so I won't go into that. I am currently working with a group called the Yarrow Institute for Organizing and Analysis. We are the ones who wrote the piece that Andrea was just referencing in Hammer and Hope under a different name. Do not look for us online yet. That is coming. And I also am working with a coalition of people called Building Community Not Prisons that is currently fighting the construction of a prison and an adjacent prison camp in eastern Kentucky on a former mountaintop removal site. So maybe I'll get into that a little bit later. And for the purposes of this evening, I will also say I am a very proud Haymarket author. I wrote with a co-author a book called How to Abolish Prisons that is available from Haymarket. So I will say in response to the question that, I maybe have a slightly narrower take on criminalization, but I would say that I think criminalization and all aspects of the prison industrial complex are employed to coerce consent and maintain control all the time, every day, under whatever circumstances that you want to consider. The prison industrial complex is the frontline enforcing arm of authoritarian and fascist forces as well, and we're seeing that accelerate, right? People don't just submit to people oppressing or repressing them. When they won't consent, regimes use force to secure submission. And so we're going to see, I think, the acceleration of that under more repressive conditions, but that is always already a pre-existing function of the prison industrial complex, which I would argue is why it has to be abolished. And I'll pass from there, Andrea.
Thanks so much. I'm excited to come back and hear more about how you see that happening. But as you mentioned, critical resistance as a formation that has been fighting criminalization in multiple forms and working towards the abolition of the prison industrial complex for over a quarter century. I'm going to turn it over to current co-director Woods Irvin, who also is a beloved former interrupting criminalization denizen. So if you could let us know how you introduce yourself, describe yourself, and let us know how you're seeing criminalization at the core of fascism and authoritarianism in this moment.
Hi, thanks so much, Andrea. And yes, also glad to be here with everyone. So yes, my name is Woods Irvin. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm with Critical Resistance, which is a 27-year-old plus grassroots organization that is committed to abolishing, building an international movement to abolish the prison industrial complex. And we have chapters all across the country. And we engage in a number of campaigns and projects in order to achieve that goal. I mean, it's hard to say much else that I feel like both Scott and Rachel kind of named like how CR approaches the connections between criminalization and the consolidation of fascism in this moment. And we understand it as the primary way in which, or the prison industrial complex is the primary way in which consent is manufactured in this country. So it's how people are forced to comply. And so some of what I want to talk about a little bit today later is some of what you were talking about, Andrea, earlier about how certain groups of people get designated as inherently criminal, and that being the sort of bedrock on which criminalization gets to flourish, primarily thinking about people who are in prison, but also caught up more broadly in the net of the prison industrial complex. And I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so looking forward to delving into all of that, and just want to bring our last but certainly not least panelist into the conversation, Andrea Dixon, who is the host of the Fascism Barometer, runs Jerry Labs. If you don't listen to the Fascism Barometer, you should also go back and listen to all of that as soon as you're done with this program. Go ahead and introduce yourself and describe yourself, Ajeris, and tell us how you understand the role of criminalization in advancing authoritarianism and fascism.
Of course. First and foremost, I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Interrupting Criminalization, for organizing this. Thank you to Haymarket. I'm Ajeris Dixon. I use they and she pronouns. I am a brown-skinned person in a blue button-up with a big old fro. And I'm the founder of Jerry Labs, the host of the Fascism Barometer, as Andrea said. I'm a long-term organizer and strategist, and supporter of organizations connected to Black-led organizing, queer and trans organizing, anti-violence work, transformative justice, and abolitionist movements. And I've started to work on fascism, but that's a little newer. I started to research fascism in 2016. Sometimes I call it my side project. But more than anything, I really was looking for resources for the communities that would be the most targeted by the fascists. So Black folks, migrants, trans folks, folks who were seeking abortions, how the climate justice movement was going to be targeted, and looking for materials and starting to kind of write articles and create workshops, and all of that work kind of culminating in the Fascism Barometer, and also this project I was in last year called Fascism 101, where it's really just about putting out political education to people about what fascism is, how we fight it, and how it connects to all of our communities. I'll just do a little bit, like the way I talk about fascism is that fascists seek to eliminate marginalized communities. They seek to eliminate dissidents, democratic practices, with this worldview that there was a past, which is often fiction, where the chosen people of a society, and for here it's like a white Christian patriarchal vision, where the chosen people had their rightful and unlimited power. So that's their goal. Fascists start often as movements, and then they seek to either create or take over parties. Then they move into state power, and they start to kind of continually deploy their power. So I was really hoping and doing a lot of work years ago to be like, can we at least reduce the access to state power for fascists and for authoritarianism? Unfortunately, we have not, but we still have some work to do. We have room to grow. And so once fascist and authoritarian movements have captured the government, as we're seeing here, criminalization is critical to the process, right? They use the prisons, they use policing, they expand criminalization. They work to grow power very, very quickly, very violently. They work to eliminate dissent, subjugate communities, and continually consolidate power. So I think the piece that I think is really important is that they move quickly and violently, in a way that can sometimes be distinct from other, like from kind of how neoliberals use criminalization. But I think that it's just really important to name that piece. I think that they also increasingly legitimate kind of paramilitary organizations that are aligned with them, but they often give them formal power. And that would be groups like the Proud Boys or white nationalist groups. So that's another piece around, like, who knows what they will be put in control of or what they will be asked to do. And sometimes it's a wink, wink, but sometimes it's literally handing over aspects of the state. So I think those were the only, like, all of these comrades are geniuses. There is very little for me to add to what they're saying, and I'm so excited to continue into the conversation with you all.
Thanks so much, Jairus. I so appreciate you constantly reminding us that fascism is a movement, not just the end result, which is the consolidation of power and what Scott was calling the administrative coup, which is, verging also on a judicial coup, and, we'll see where the military goes. Hopefully not soon. But I think that part about the movement is also important. I know we're all a little bit saturated with conversations about how we got here, because we're here and we need to figure out how to navigate here. But I do think that it's important to talk about how criminalization was mobilized by the movement, even when fascist movements, even when they're not in power. It's part of how they get in power, whether they're making claims that certain groups of people eat pets, or that certain groups of people are threatening the fairness of women's sports, or certain groups of people are threatening, bathrooms, or certain groups of people are threatening population growth. I mean, or obviously that migrants are a massive threat to everyone's security, whether it's job security, safety security, or the security of the nation. Like, those kinds of criminalizing narratives don't necessarily always come with criminal laws attached, but they are very effective in stoking the fear that then kind of manufactures the consent that brings them into power and keeps them in power, even as they engage in higher and higher and higher levels of violence. And so I think that's where I want to take us now, is to ask folks to really dive into where you see the greatest threats of criminalization, both kind of in the literal sense that we know, like passing and enforcing criminal laws, but also in this sort of larger narrative sort of ethos in this moment. And I would ask that you include at least one hidden threat, because I think there's so much going on and so much coming at us that there are places we're not looking where maybe we need to be looking, because that's part of their goal, is to keep us so disoriented and confused that we're not looking at the worst things that they're doing. So I think this time I will ask you first, Rachel, to sort of share where you think the most urgent threats are, and at least one hidden one.
Yeah, I think that all of the threats are urgent right now, and I don't say that only to equivocate. I mean, I think that we have to take seriously the urgency of the moment and the seriousness of the moment. So I say that by way of saying it's all high alert. You know, we'll probably get higher alert even. I know that Egeris does a barometer reading at the beginning of all of the podcasts, and I don't know that you've gotten to high alert yet, Egeris, so I don't think we're there. I trust you on that. But that doesn't mean we're not needing to be urgent. That being said, I think I'm going to cheat a little bit. I know you'd expect nothing less of me, Andrea, but I think my hidden answer and my unhidden answer are essentially the same, that I'm feeling very, very concerned right now about preemptive compliance. And I'm worried about that in part because the unquestioning acceptance of the presence of surveillance, of policing, of imprisonment as kind of allowed aspects of the prison industrial complex become more kind of understood as natural or necessary helps us be lulled into submission and think that they're not disruptions or encroachments, right? And you know, we're seeing this in a variety of ways. We're seeing the creeping influence of this through social media and kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Participatory surveillance, right? That people are sharing stuff of themselves that maybe isn't the right stuff to be sharing or would give more access than they might otherwise want. Or we're seeing, you know, similarly like Nextdoor, those kinds of social media platforms, or people's like Ring cameras on their doors, or the presence of cops every which way you look, or the kind of naturalization of a landscape that's dotted with prisons or the use of biometrics in airports, right? There's all this kind of stuff that has become so commonplace as to be somewhat hidden or taken for granted in our daily lives. And this feels urgent to me because if you accept my earlier premise that the prison industrial complex is the enforcing arm of repressive regimes, then rolling over on that creeping influence of different aspects of the prison industrial complex makes it even easier for regimes to take hold, to increase power, and to exert control. And so I think, you know, we will see this as we as the regimes ratchet up, and I think, you know, as we get closer and closer to global economic catastrophe, we will see even more tighten up and even more repression. And I do think that our acceptance of being preemptively disciplined through an acceptance of these different elements of the prison industrial complex really makes us vulnerable. Non-compliance, I think, is essential here. And I'm not trying to be, you know, flip about the potential repercussions of non-compliance or of resisting cops or resisting surveillance or the apparatus of the courts or imprisonment. But I do think minimally, not taking them for granted is incredibly important, and probably even more effective is to understand them as aberrations and incursions in our lives and figure out how to reduce their power at every turn. I think doing that positions us better to fight back against other aspects of these repressive regimes.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I think the temptation as things get worse is, as people feel more and more insecure, is to lean into those things as opposed to fight back against them. And so I do appreciate that as a hidden threat, even in kind of our movements in our sectors in this moment. On this question of compliance in advance, one of the places we've seen that a great deal is when it comes to trans folks and criminalization of trans people. And so Woods, you and I first met, you know, when you were working with criminalized trans youth on the streets of Chicago, and also when you were working with criminalized trans adults in the streets of San Francisco. And so what's happening now in some ways is not new. It hasn't necessarily always been law, but it's definitely been practiced. And also, too, it is accelerating and becoming enshrined. And what feels most alarming is the degree of compliance in advance before even any laws are passed, or when laws, just a threat to funding or just an executive order that kind of throws an anti-trans temper tantrum is leading people to deny, not only to criminalize people in bathrooms or in public spaces, but to deny people life-saving healthcare and other kinds of care and access. So I'm curious, both to your answer to the question of where you see the biggest threats of criminalization and where you might see some hidden threats, but also how you're seeing that compliance and advance as a form of criminalization without criminal law.
I think my response, thank you for that question. My response is those that is tied together. I think what we've been seeing at Critical Resistance is maybe a doubling down of criminalization of communities that are already criminalized, right? And so by sort of building that as a bedrock to like extend further on, that's how we've been seeing in the right take or advance criminalization across the country. Some of the ways we've been seeing this clearly coming out of 2022, there was the right sort of succeeded in that, you know, Gramscian trick of reframing what was happening in 2020. And manufacturing a crime wave, right? And so making so that people who are understanding themselves as being destabilized by the political economy and COVID and the multiple crises that we were seeing coming to a head at that time, being turned into a crisis of, targeting particularly like poor people, vulnerable people. So there's like that has essentially resulted in sort of solidifying at the same time as Trump was elected in November, the passage of, Prop 36 in California, which recriminalized low-level drug offenses and theft, the recriminalization of drug use, low-level drug use in places like Portland, the reintroduction of the Letcher County, the FCI Letcher, which Rachel was talking about, in a poverty-stricken part of the country, Appalachia. And this sort of even in sort of more like the more liberal parts of the country, this sort of double things like mental health jail, so the carceral humanist move around mental health jails and mental health responses that are deeply tied to policing, even though we were trying as much as we could in 2020 to unbound those two together. So I think we've been seeing a lot of that. And then for folks who are inside of prison, we've been seeing a sort of like return to or deep like an attempt to separate imprisoned people from sort of political communication on the outside. So there's more repression of political information that goes to people inside, and I think by sort of deepening that repression, deepening that bedrock of criminalization, both of people who are incarcerated, but also people who are being regularly policed by the prison industrial complex, that sort of allows for, as I was saying earlier, some of that criminalization to unfold. Some of what we're seeing, like some of how that is manifesting, is even in one of our campaigns, the Dignity Not Detention campaign in New York State that we're doing, which would break contracts with ICE in New York State. Even with, I think, a lot of work that abolitionists have done over the last decade to move some of the conversation around good immigrant versus bad immigrant, like framing, we're still seeing in this moment of urgency and fear that dichotomy starting to come back up, and the deprioritizing of something like cages and policing capacity, by which ICE will be actually able to deport people, right? So if we're able to sort of take some of those chunks out, both in terms of capacity, but the logic by which they are there, that actually can curtail the ability for the criminalization that the right is trying to do to actually, for them to be able to make good on it. You made mention of working with trans people. I think what's happening with trans people inside is tied to what's happening with trans people outside, because trans people are being framed as inherently violent and more threatening to inherently violent. That allows for, that could be the basis by which trans people can can end up with less access to care inside of prisons, but also we're seeing some of the potential basis for expansion specifically for how trans people are caged, right? So that was something that was emerging back in 2016, but we're starting to see some of that reemerging. So the threat of trans people and this meaning that there's no place that makes sense for them to be caged, and therefore needing to expand cages in order to put them into cages, is where that's kind of at. And I think lastly, I'll say, and I'll make this really quick, to just build on what Rachel was saying, the criminalization of organizing is also something to continue to keep an eye on, whether that be, everything that's happening with the targeting of the Cop City organizers out of Atlanta, the targeting of Palestinian organizers, as we're seeing right now, the threat of HR 9495, having this overall, chilling effect as it's meant to do. So maybe that's also, I hope that was also, I don't know if that's hidden, but I think it's like core. So there you go.
Thanks, Woods. There's so many threads to pull on what you were saying. I think one that I want to focus on is the recriminalization of so much that we were fighting to decriminalize, and then how that was married to the anti-immigrant attacks through Lake and Riley Act. So theft and drug possession and other minor offenses or public order offenses being recriminalized, and then married to mandatory detention for any migrants who are undocumented who engage in them is a way that those things are building on each other and expanding. And the compliance of Democrats in passing that legislation shows how much purchase those criminalizing narratives about migrants had to be able to just say, if you get caught shoplifting diapers that you need because you can't afford them because you can't get a job because you're undocumented, you will now go to mandatory detention. And we have normalized that now as a natural consequence, before even January 20th happened. And then you referred back to the backlash to 2020. And part of the reason we wanted to have this conversation is because there's, in some progressive circles or liberal circles, there's this notion that our fight against criminalization went too far, and that's part of how we got here. When in fact, our fight against criminalization was essential to not getting here. And so it feels really critical to kind of help folks shift that understanding, because I think there's a notion now that we can't talk about criminalization because that's how the fascists got in power. They sort of beat us on criminalization, or we lost a narrative fight, when in fact, we really need to understand that it was that we didn't fight hard enough against criminalization, and that is what enabled this regime, writ large, criminalization writ large, is what is actually paved the way for this regime to come forward. So I did hear you say on the last fascism barometer that we are at high, Jairus. So maybe tell us where the greatest threats of criminalization, including the hidden ones, are at the high fascism. I'm sure there's many other levels beyond that, but where we are right now.
Yeah, the problem with starting a barometer like 6 or 7 months ago is that you didn't start it low. So then you start to just like do that thing that where it's just like bad, very, very bad. I really agree with Rachel in this conversation that there's so many urgent threats right now. And I think that's part of our assignment, right? Part of our assignment is how do we balance all of the urgent threats in coordination with forward motion organizing, right? Like that's one of the biggest challenges. And as everyone's saying, the criminalization of trans communities, of immigrants, of Palestinian protesters, of community organizations, I'm hearing more and more about the targeting of like critical parts of the electoral infrastructure. Like there's a hearing of Act Blue happening that would take away a lot of access to funding for different progressive candidates. The targeting of Muslim groups that's happened way before this wave of MAGA, of POC organizations, of reproductive justice, like using this manipulation of the definition of anti-Semitism to actually push criminalization on college campuses, and also to disappear protesters and to disappear immigrants, but particularly like forcing certain types of charges or certain types of policing on college campuses because they are not like in accordance with a particular definition of anti-Semitism, and also using kind of government grants as the wedge. I'm really looking at the Insurrection Act and keeping kind of like a sharp eye right there, recognizing that in one of Trump's first executive orders, he ordered a study of the usage of the Insurrection Act, which would then allow, whatever, they do what they want, but on paper, it allows the deployment of the military, like domestically. And so what they say is it's to kind of look at what they're calling an emergency on the border. But I think we should not be surprised if that's just, if they're saying like we would use the Insurrection Act around immigration or immigrants at the border. But I think it's really just a ruse to use the Insurrection Act to actually target activists and to target all sorts of communities. It's really in that, like, first they come for this community and then they use that mechanism. So we should be looking at it's all day long, people are asking me, what's the next thing? What's the critical thing? And it's actually, there are so many different levers at this stage that it's actually hard to do something that predictive, but you can actually talk about like the broad strokes. The other thing I'm really looking at is that in the last, 3 or 4 days, Trump was talking about deporting all prisoners to El Salvador. And Pat Bondi was looking at that. And now again, they're saying, similar thing, like very violent, that they want to like they've expanded the defense budget to $1 trillion. So it's going to be everyone, and it's going to be us unless we stop it. And I think that's the point. So people tend to think, or it is emotionally logical for some people to feel that maybe if I don't speak out, or maybe if I don't get involved, I could be safe. There is no safe under this context unless you're like with the fascists. And even then, some of y'all will end up in jail next to us. So therefore, like this is about like mass noncompliance, mass protest, and fighting criminalization and fighting fascism simultaneously intertwined, all of us together, like for the safety of our communities, but also to protect the political work that we all hold dear and have been building to for so long.
So true. I just this piece about compliance, our own compliance being, and our own participation in criminalization being the biggest threat in some ways, feels really critical to name. You also named this sort of international component of the moment, and Scott, I feel like your newsletter does such an incredible job of naming kind of the global authoritarian coalition, and also drawing on lessons from global movements against fascism and authoritarianism, the first of which is to understand what's happening more clearly, which you do such a great job of helping us do. So I am very curious to hear where you see the biggest threats are, including hidden threats around criminalization as part of this consolidation of fascism.
Well, thanks for that. It's a big compliment coming from you. So, well, first, just talking about that international context, I think it's really important for us to grok that, right? Because the people like Trump, people like Elon Musk, operate within international networks of authoritarians that are operating all over the world. And so they are in, deep relationship with Vladimir Putin or Viktor Orban or, you name it, right? And in that context, they learn from each other and also learn from the forms of resistance people put up to those regimes so that they can prepare for them, right? And so we should just keep that in mind. At this point, the balance of power is very different in the world than it was in, say, 1965, when the United States was involved in a major struggle against a white supremacist authoritarian regime, right? Back then, the Cold War clarified a kind of democratic set of norms, such that democracies around the world were relatively stable and were basically the dominant force, right? And since that time, things have changed dramatically. So, states like Turkey, for example, of India, Hungary, that were then promising democracies are now not counted as democracies by many of the global watchdog groups that are, keeping an eye on what's happening out there. And we've seen authoritarian consolidation in Russia and China, and increasing global influence being exercised by those states. And then the emergence of something quite different than we would have had in the last century, which are competitive authoritarian systems, right? They maintain a democratic facade while undermining democratic substance. So they may have elections, but the elections are unlikely to ever result in a change in the balance of power. But then by participation in elections, the opposition actually feeds the authoritarians knowledge they need in order to be able to stay there. And then those states evolving, which is now a trend, into direct dictatorships. So one of the threats that we're facing here is that as the numbers for the current administration drop in terms of popularity and resistance grows, we may see some gains made in the midterm elections for those who are concerned about freedom and democracy. And we may feel like we're getting set up well for the next national election to be able to see if we can install a different kind of system of governance. But the trend is that once in power, authoritarians basically use their position in order to steal the next election if they feel their power is being threatened. And so we need to prepare for that. So that's one big thing that needs some careful consideration. You reference capitalism as part of this, and it's a really difficult discussion to have in many of the anti-authoritarian circles in which I'm active. But I think it's a really important thing to reference, and it does help to understand the nature of the threat, right? That what we've seen here is the rise in the United States around the middle of the last century of a kind of class of cowboy entrepreneurs, basically neoliberals, who exploited various different kinds of social trends and movements and deployed them in order to be able to build a base to take power, right? Through the establishment of neoliberal policies and norms, they have been able to consolidate unprecedented unlimited amounts of wealth and power, and insulated financial markets from democratic decision-making. Now, they no longer really need democracy in order to be able to hold power in this global system that has been created. And so they are basically attacking democracy as the last potential means of limiting that wealth and power. The threat to that wealth and power lies therein, right? So however we think of democracy, flawed or not, it does provide that means. They recognize it, and so they're closing the door. And that's something they will probably do with some ruthlessness. So Ejira says that the alert is high. I agree. I also think we should remember in that global context, though, there's also Singapore, there's Russia, there's Hungary. There are many other expressions and directions that we may be going in, and we should anticipate those. And keep in mind that the people in power now have a kind of mixed bag of ideologies, but they've come together and being able to express power by developing what we need on our side, which is basically a strategically aligned field of practice, right? Shared language, tools, and tactics under a strategic umbrella that holds all of the pieces together. But that doesn't mean that the pieces don't potentially have the ability to fight with one another or fall apart or fall out. Just as on our side, if we were to be able to develop such a field, that would be a constant threat. And so we need to get in there and recognize that diversity and try to exacerbate the divisions between those different factions, right? By highlighting the differences as much as possible. So keep in mind, for example, that Sam Altman, in the OpenAI guy, is basically in like an all-out war with Elon Musk. So there's a possibility of wedging in there and perhaps then producing new pockets of capital for people who are trying to build resistance. And so all of that stuff's out there. But I will say, in terms of the threat, you know, we're looking at expanded detention powers with reduced judicial oversight, broader criminalization of the dissent and protest, increased surveillance, which of course was normalized as the carceral state developed, and with fewer civil liberties protections, and then selective enforcement targeting political opponents and marginalized communities, and not stopping there, but kind of using them as demonstration sites. So for example, this offshoring of detention that we were seeing, people being deported to other countries where they then enter that criminal system, right? Takes people totally out of U.S. jurisdiction and basically disappears them. You know, think about Chile and the number of people in Chile who were disappeared. This is a kind of form of disappearing people, right? And so the threat is there for all of us, you know, looking at what's happening there. And we need to recognize that this can get worse than that, right? Extrajudicial murders, such as we have seen in the Philippines, for example. You know, direct attacks on people's personal lives and safety are also on the menu and possible in the future. And so all of that's really scary. But as Rachel said, you know, this kind of obeying in advance is a very bad idea. And it's a very bad idea for a number of reasons, not just because it does kind of clear the way for those folks, but because one of the hidden things, one of the surprises, is that we have way more power than we imagine ourselves to have, right? Their banks can't function without our deposits. You know, their fulfillment centers can do nothing without our labor, right? You know, all of these things are within our ability to, you know, that's our potential capacity. And so when we obey in advance, we give that stuff up, right? The possibility of the general strike, the possibility of a run on the bank, a possibility of all of those things that could curb the kind of rapacity in which these folks are just going after things one after another and slow things down, if not stop them. It's been demonstrated in many places around the world. I mean, Marcos was ousted in the Philippines in, what was it, 1974, I think? Largely because they were able to get a faction of the military to defect. The Catholic Church moved on their side, and then they engaged in giant strikes and organized a run on the state-owned bank. That's what ultimately got Ronald Reagan to push Ferdinand Marcos out of power and moved him over to the Hawaii, where I was living at the time, where we all got to protest his arrival. But, you know, that's something that we have. And so it's a hidden threat to the other side. We can't give it up. We just need to build the infrastructure so we can collectively express that power. And obeying advance totally directly goes against that. So hold on to what you got. It's really valuable.
Thank you so much, Scott. You are taking us into the next section about kind of writ large, how people can interrupt criminalization. I just want to pull on a couple of things that you said. One, as you referenced the Philippines, the extrajudicial executions, we should remember, weren't just political opponents. They were part of the drug war, right? And so again, criminalization names who's going to be targeted very clearly. And so fighting authoritarianism means fighting against the drug war, right? That's not something that's coming up in anti-authoritarian circles right now, but it is the drug war is part of what he's mobilizing to say that the US is is at war. It's part of what he's saying to justify invading Canada. I have to tell you, I was born in Canada, and when I tell people that Fox News is saying that Canada has been overtaken by fentanyl drug cartel, wait, what now? Like, what? And they're not used to the global north being framed as criminalized in that way, in the same way that Mexico has been framed that way forever. But it is very much part of it, right? It's how criminalization is mobilized for the imperial aspirations of fascist regimes. And then to your point about capitalism, I think it is very telling that immediately the success of Tesla takedown is being met with threats of criminalization at the level of domestic terrorism, because it is a direct confrontation of capital and the way in which capital has, more blatantly seized control of the state in this moment to the ends that you were just describing. And so it means that Stop Cop City is not something that's like over there that we need to pay attention to because it was a fight against policing. It was also a fight against corporate interests, but also that was a blueprint for what's going to be applied to any resistance that we mount, especially resistance that directly confronts capital. So, and I want us to also think about civil actions as a way of criminalizing as well. Like, people who know my history know I am no fan of Greenpeace, but they just suffered this tremendous, criminalizing attack that came through civil means and through corporations coming for them directly for the attack. So all of those things felt important from the point of view of things that you were just saying. And I just want to bring interrupting criminalization was not only founded to look at interrupting criminalization, but looking at it through the lens of racialized gender and sexuality. Because when we look at criminalization through the lens of Black women, queer and trans people's experiences, we see its scope and reach and multiplicity of forms more clearly. And we see more clearly how institutions that are not necessarily seen as part of the PIC, like the medical industrial complex, or what Woods was referring to, the kind of carceral care institutions, are engaged in policing and criminalization. And I think that's really being lifted up right now. And the threat of just criminalization of bodily autonomy, like, period, whether it's self-managed care, reproductive care, gender affirming care, mental health care, and that's manifesting through threats like designation of abortion medication or gender affirming care medication as a controlled substance, bringing it into the realm of the drug war. Or there's a hidden threat in passing, laws that provide for fetal personhood, for the notion that from the moment of conception, an embryo is a person at law. And you might pass that through a tax law so that someone who has an embryo gets a tax credit, but then it gets used to criminalize in other ways. I think the enforcement of harboring laws is a way of getting at the kinds of mutual aid and self-managed organizing that we're doing to kind of get around or resist the resistance of the state, and that those are all very much targeting people's entitlement to manage their own care, their own bodies, and to do that in concert and coalition with others. And particularly also targeting bodily autonomy of disabled people, this notion that RFK is going to take everyone who takes antidepressants and throw us all on an organic farm somewhere while simultaneously dismantling every kind of support for any kind of crisis or illness that isn't in a prison or a cage or a farm, is a kind of criminalization that we need to be thinking about. So those are some of the things that came to mind for me when thinking about this question. So obviously we want to shift to what we can do. I want us to start kind of writ large, like what are the sort of along the lines of what you were saying, Scott, like where do we find the divisions? Where do we need to sort of shift our perspectives? Where do we need to make challenges within our movements around capitalism, or things like appealing to the rule of law, which the rule of law is the carceral state. And what I learned in law school is that the rule of law is whatever the fuck they say it is. And literally my con law professor affirmed that for me when I raised my hand in class and said, it seems like. So we need to really think about how we shift, for instance, those perspectives, and do that internal work within ourselves and our movements. But I am curious kind of what, and I'm going to ask you first, Ajaris, because you're the movement, you're a movement maven that I look to for like thinking about how we should be organizing. So writ large, before we get into specific campaigns, which we'll do next, writ large, how do you think people can and should be interrupting criminalization as part of this broader kind of big tent, multi-front, multi-tendency fight against authoritarianism and fascism?
Well, I'll do my best. Sometimes I wish I could travel time or travel realms and like talk to different movement ancestors. And so George Jackson is front of mind right now. And George Jackson would tell us to settle our quarrels, to come together, and to understand that fascism is already here, right? And so I think the first thing is that we must defeat the fascists. We have to substantially and significantly reduce MAGA's power by all the levers of power. I've been thinking so much about the election results, and this one statistic that 3 out of 10 Black men under 45 voted for Trump. So there's a crew of folks who are deeply impacted by criminalization who voted for fascists. Now, that may not be where they are. That may not mean that they didn't get all the information or the political education, but we need to actually see that as an opportunity. That is a tremendous base building and political education opportunity that we need to take, and we need to be building within our communities and building within communities of people who are most harmed by criminal legal system, by prisons, by policing, by surveillance, and bringing them in closer to our movements. We have to politicize folks. I think every aspect of the prison industrial complex that you have the strategic ability to dismantle, you do it now, right? But I think that's a read of the conditions, because that may not be, it depends on where you are, what you're located in, the power that you have and the power that you're up against. But to assume that we can't do that, I think is erroneous. I just think we need to talk about the specific conditions. think we need to expand community defense, but expand community defense in accordance with organizing, right? So that every organization has a safety and security team located within a broader region around safety and security, that people are thinking about what are the different ways that the state, that police, that the FBI could be challenging our group, and how do we continue our political work moving forward under those conditions, right? I think we have to join anti-MAGA, anti-fascist, and anti-authoritarian coalitions. Even if we agree with some of their premises, even if we agree with some of their narratives, as criminalization rapidly expands and more people are pulled up into it, there will be an opportunity to push those formations left. There will be an opportunity to have a whole host of conversations about criminalization for folks who may not actually have thought about it in that way. And I think we need to be there. We need to be there to have those conversations. And I think this is an opportunity to grow abolitionist movements, to build new connections, to find places in agreement, and places where I think the invitation is into strategic nuance here, right? And I want us to take up the invitation. There have been times where we have declined the invitation, where we have built into the politics of either or in a way that is not actually connected. And so I've been saying that fascism is like a video game. And it's a video game where, as opposed to a video game where when you lose a level, you get to replay it. Fascism, you lose the level, then you get a harder level, right? And so we are now in a harder level, and we need to kind of show up and be there for the challenge. And I think the other piece is we have to think about short-term and long-term strategy, connected and together. So if we're only thinking about the short term, we will always be on the back foot, right? And so we need to actually think, what is the world that we want? The connection to the world that we have actually grounded, and have those conversations in accordance with each other. Yeah, that's where I'm thinking kind of like writ large.
Thanks so much, Jairus. Rachel, you are also someone who, as an OG abolitionist, like someone who people would lift up and be like, if I thought of an abolitionist, it would be Rachel, who always says, we don't leave any tools on the table. Like, you can use any tool in an abolitionist way. Like, don't get caught up in like purity politics to the expense of action. So I'm curious how you're thinking about how we need to be challenging and resisting criminalization kind of writ large in this moment.
Well, I would start there. Use all the tools for abolitionist purposes. Don't use all the tools just to do any old thing. And then I would say, yes, ditto what Ijera said, but I always say yes, ditto what Ijera said. And now for the generic ones, because I'm kind of a generic person in thinking about this question, and my answers are always the same. Answer one, organize. Organize, organize, organize. Join an organization. Join a project. Get involved in doing work that moves your principles, your values forward. Do that with other people. Don't try to go it alone. And to Ijeris's point, if you are an organization, join with other organizations. We need bigger, tougher, beefier formations to fight this fight. And so we can't be purist, we can't go it alone. And there are ways that we can collaborate that just build a lot more power than what we have right now. So that's one. Two is the same old thing I've been saying all night, practice noncompliance. And I think there are many, many ways of doing that. And Scott, I really appreciated your expansion of that idea. I think that I completely agree with you. We don't want to give up before we've even started. So practicing noncompliance, I think, is key. Practicing internationalism, I think, is key. And I don't just mean like knowing good examples from other places, although that doesn't hurt. But I mean, being in material solidarity with other people in other places. As Scott laid out, you know, we're seeing authoritarianism on the rise globally. There are many people in those places working at the same things we are. We should be doing that together. And then the last one is the golden oldie, study. Study alone, study with other people, study history, study, you know, what's happening in other places. You know, I mean, understanding even, I hate to keep picking on the Philippines because the Philippine struggle is remarkable. But even in the examples we were using tonight, right, these are multiple historical periods in Philippines. This is not a single example, right? So how did people fight in the 80s? How did people fight in the 20 teens, right? We can learn a lot of lessons that we can apply, but we have to put ourselves to learning those lessons and continuing to learn in all of the ways, whether that is listening to a really kick-ass podcast like Ijeris's, or that's being in a study group, or that's doing political education inside your organization, or coming to a thing like this event tonight. Lots and lots of ways to keep learning, and I think that that's super important for us to always be doing.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Sorry, I'm just thinking about the thing that you were saying about internationalism. And just, I think for me, there's also a piece in there about understanding criminalization at a global scale too, right? And that doesn't mean just thinking about criminalization of migration, period, and being in solidarity with all migrants, including people who are of no state, right? But also understanding and thinking also about like criminalization of states for refusing to comply with the commands of the U.S. You know, fascist imperial state, right? So visa holders from South Sudan are now having their visas revoked because South Sudan said no to the U.S. My understanding is that people from Bhutan are now being kidnapped, green card holders, refugees, and so on, and being, you know, dropped at a border that they are then being told to cross into a place that they claimed refugee status from because that state didn't comply with X, Y, and Z. So to really think about that level of criminalization and to understand Palestine as you know, the worst manifestation of criminalization in this moment. And to understand that criminalization operates at the same at every level. So no Israeli official is ever going to be criminalized for what's happening. Criminalization at the international level only also applies to Black people and brown people and people from small marginalized states, right? Who engage in either genocidal behavior or behavior that resists the U.S. Hegemony. So I do think internationalism also requires us not only to be in solidarity with criminalized people everywhere, and that means migrants everywhere, but also to understand how criminalization is operating at this kind of supra-state level, and to be against that. Woods, I really appreciate so much how much CR always keeps us focused on, and you do this too, Rachel, all of us do to a different extent, but focused on the people inside. And how our movement in this moment cannot forget that we need to be in solidarity with, in study with, and in struggle with people behind walls, and being attending to those conditions, particularly because the project is to get more of us behind those walls, right? And so we need to really be building those lines and strengthening them, not abandoning them. So I'm curious what you think about that as one thing people need to be doing in this moment, and then what other priorities you think people need to have.
Yes, building on what you said and what Majerus and Rachel said, engage in campaigns and projects to tear down walls, work with people who are currently incarcerated as part of doing that work. As you can, given your conditions, their time, place, conditions on the ground. I think I definitely agree around this need to engage in sort of a recommitment to base building and organizing, to reclaim our communities in who you might consider, or might be named as the center, in terms of everyday folks, to continue to figure out ways to pull them into our project, to pull them into this broader abolitionist leftist orientation that we're aiming to do. I think part of the fascist project is about drawing lines of belonging between who is inside and who is outside. And so we have to be thinking about how do we pull together a project that is able to do that, without using the framing of innocence. And because I think that's a place where we can get caught up, right? And I would also say that there is something to do there's something around what you mentioned also earlier, Andrea, around the carceral humanism, and trying to make sure that we don't also get caught up in that sort of trap of, well, we can expand criminalization, imprisonment, policing of the folks that we consider most dangerous along the edges of our community, as long as they're tied to services, as long as they're tied to some ghost of a carrot. So that's what I would add.
Thanks so much, Scott. You started us on this conversation of the big picture things we should be doing. Can you close us out on big picture stuff before we start dropping specific things people can be doing?
Well, I want to plus one Woods's call to action around taking down walls. We need to work internationally, so across borders, but we also need to be aware that prisons are a really critical part of the kind of machinery of repression, and knowing what's going on the inside is really critical to how we behave on the outside. We need to stay in relationship with that population. I earlier said, I think that capitalism is part of this problem. I didn't say that because I was trying to get people to go out and smash capitalism, though if that's your jam, you should do it. But to basically make it clear that there's a profit that's being made from authoritarianism, right? In fact, in the field that I work on, people refer to these strongmen kind of populist reactionaries as ethnic entrepreneurs. They basically profit off of all of the things that they're doing, and look at how many people have in fact profited, right? So one of the things we need to do is try to figure out how to reduce that profit. And so there are a lot of different ways to do that. We talked about general strikes and what our relationship is to the financial system, et cetera. We can also continue to advocate for reform in our financial system. All of those things still matter. We need to be demanding economic democracy all the time, even while this crisis is happening, because that's where we're going to be losing a lot of ground if we don't keep our eye on the ball and keep making our demands. They become invisible to the public behind the smokescreen of all of the stuff that's happening, right? One of the reasons why they do this thing of flooding the zone, which is a term that Steve Bannon, icon of the white nationalist movement, has popularized, is in order to distract us from the kind of structural reforms that have the biggest difference in terms of how they are able to take power, right? And so there's so many things to keep track of. The media will always go to the sexiest, most kind of flashy thing, right? But some of the stuff that's happening behind that screen really matters to us. And certainly the attempts to, destroyed regulatory agencies, to take down specific kinds of regulation, attacks on the EPA, all of those things are about increasing profit, and so we need to keep our eyes on that stuff. The other thing is to think internationally and be really clear that we need those relationships across borders. There's much we can learn from people. There is, for example, a really robust pro-democracy movement in Thailand, and the Thais are just geniuses. I mean, they have so much to teach us. One of the key things there is that they're trying to win back trust in institutions, but doing it by demanding transparency and accountability, and choosing really popular issues like potable water, because there's almost no potable water coming out of the tap in Thailand, and water is expensive, in order to be able to make their case with people at the local level. They also organize around LGBTQ issues. They organize young people. But then critical to all of that is that they have a single political home that all these streams feed into, which is various iterations of the parties that they form. The Future Forward Party, which was then banned by the junta and made illegal, and then the Move Forward Party that they formed in the wake of that got banned and made illegal. But with each election, they are making more and more gains. And it's because you're able to consolidate all of the different kinds of organizing, right? They don't try to control it. They're not trying to get in people's way. We need to allow these things to come up organically, but then they have a kind of pipeline or series of pipelines that then all feed into the ability to express themselves in elections and at other critical turning points through mass mobilization. So that's something that I think we all should be thinking about. It's going to require a lot of cooperation. And at the foundation of that, we will be required to build networks. Organizations should start thinking about redistributive power, right? To really start to think about how to not be so tightly consolidated around certain bases, but to really invest in local organizing, but then network those local nodes together so that with each node that's added, the distributive power of every other node increases, and our ability to communicate across those nodes in order to be able to achieve the goals we want to achieve becomes more and more possible. So think about that, and then think about mutual aid. It seems like a small gesture in a terrible situation, but actually mutual aid really, really matters. It absolutely matters. It is not just about providing for people's needs. Mutual aid, being able to provide for each other in community, is the way most people experience power in their day-to-day lives. It's very intimate to them, and when those systems get attacked, they react very strongly, right? Because they understand what it means to them and how it shapes their lives day to day. Democracy gives you, not in an evenly distributed way, but the space to be able to establish those kinds of mutual aid relationships. And as that space compresses, that's one of the ways. It's another kind of barometer, like Idris's barometer. So we should be thinking about that and really understanding one key thing that I want everybody to just take away with them. The success of these far-right movements and organizing is contingent on something they understood really early on, which is at the end of the Cold War, that the new political battle lines would be built upon cultural fault lines. And so they took advantage of that, right? They exploited our sexism and our patriarchal relations, and they exploited our racism and our trans and homophobia and, you know, many other things, right? They exploited people's concern about secular education overtaking Christian values and morals that held patriarchal families together. They did all of these kinds of things, but they also targeted their organizing efforts to places where there was lots of social capital. So the biggest example of that, the most obvious one, is churches, right? And the evangelical movement in general, which was a culturally conservative movement that went for Carter in 76 and Reagan in 80. So, you know, I mean, they did that quickly, right? But we should be thinking the same way. So when we think of labor organizing, there should be labor organizing everywhere, but think about things like, you know, fulfillment centers, because those places are rich in social capital. Social capital is the basis of social efficacy, and social efficacy is what you need in order to be able to effectively organize. We lost that with the loss of the core, industrial core of our economy and the collapse of company towns. They saw that dilemma that we were in, and they went where people were going in order to try to find new community and built there. So we should be thinking in that same way. And, you know, just as one thing, because I think people find this fun or scary but fun. In Moscow, Idaho, something called Christ Church, which is a Christian nationalist church, has basically taken over the town, or is taking over the town, right? One of the ways they're able to do that is they study data. They, you know, like they do data analytics. And so they figure out, for every person we now have who is a congregant in Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, how many children do those people have to have in order for us to reach a numerical majority by a certain year? And then they encourage their congregants to have that many children. They figure out what businesses should we take over or establish in order to put us in a key position to be able to control the local economy. They make those kinds of calculations. We need to be that savvy.
But not that population.
But not imperialist, right? We're
Right.
That's happening how we think about where the best investments are to be made in order for us to be able to create the kind of centers of gravity that more and more people can come around and take refuge in.
For sure. And I think that goes to what Ageris was saying at the beginning about centering our corals. And I think that includes within our movements, and that includes not reveling in the criminalization of people who we're upset with, who maybe voted a way that we didn't vote, or who we shouldn't be reveling in anyone's criminalization. And I think that we need to really get clear about that any criminalization is going to come back and haunt us and be used against us, and we should be fighting it for everyone. I feel like I am constantly hearing echoes of what Rachel is always saying, and heard on the Convergence podcast the other day, someone say really clearly, like, we spend a lot of time and energy thinking about how to make the argument and not a lot of time and energy on how to make the relationships to convey and share the sense making, the study, the practice, the building of the networks. And that we need to build the world we want and invite people into it in a way that fuels belonging and does the mutual aid that the right actually got here doing, mutual aid and building those networks of support and being there for each other in crisis. And fascism feeds on crisis. And so we need to show another way to respond to crisis that's not criminalization. You know, care is the antidote to criminalization. So we need to figure that out. So I'm going to close by just asking everyone to share one campaign folks can get involved in, and then close by sharing a resource that we created that can help people sort of find what works for them in their community, which, as Ageris was saying. So I'll start by saying that we need to organize care workers into a culture of refusal in this moment, as various forms of care are being criminalized and various populations are being criminalized and denied care, including folks behind bars and including trans folks behind bars. So Interrupting Criminalization has the Beyond Do No Harm Network, which pulls together healthcare providers committed to interrupting criminalization. We host monthly resistance labs, we create resources, and we build pods across the country to build those networks that you're talking about, Scott. So hopefully Sean will drop in the chat more information, the link to more about that and how folks can get involved. And then Rachel, what should people specifically be getting into right now?
if you hate prisons, you should fight prisons. And there is a very good opportunity to fight a federal prison, so it matters to all of us. It's not a local fight. By getting involved with the Building Community Not Prisons Coalition. Sean, I think you have the link for that. It's, if we really do believe that the prison industrial complex is at the front edge of enforcing authoritarianism and fascism, we need to take those tools away, right? The same way I believe that we use every tool available to us on the table, we take away as many tools from them as we can, and prisons are a big one. So I would encourage people to learn more about that fight and get involved as they can.
Thanks, Woods. Where do people get in with critical resistance or other campaigns you think they need to get involved in?
Yes, if you live in the Bay, LA, Portland, New York, or in Appalachia or in Atlanta, come and join one of our many campaigns to fight the prison industrial complex. If you do not, you can also always work with us on our Abolitionist newspaper. I'm going to drop it. I'm going to drop it in the chat, but hopefully we can also share that. Our next issue that we're currently working on is about repression of incarcerated people. So if you're interested in writing something and reading more about it, check us out. Join us in the fight, or start a fight of your own. And I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks. Jairus, where do you want to point people to, other than, of course, listening to the Fascism Barometer? Oh, you're muted, Jairus. We can't hear your brilliance right now.
You just saw me like doing all that. Okay. So I would say join every campaign that people have already listed. I would suggest that if you're in an organization, to really focus on growing your base. And if you are interested in just resources on what fascism means for you, to listen to the Fascism Barometer, but also look at the Resource Hub, because we create learning guides for every single episode so that you can actually use them within your group. So you don't have to become an expert on fascism. You just can take the agenda and just follow the steps. Or you can, or people are actually creating Fascism Barometer book clubs where they listen to the barometer and then go and take action. And I'll make sure to list all of your stuff on our Resource Hub as well.
Thanks. Scott, what are you pointing people to?
Well, there are a couple of quick things. One is people should be paying attention to the networks that have been established by people with disabilities. They are mutual aid networks. They're support networks that then are repurposed for political, mobilizations that are incredibly effective. They're the people who are organizing in the disability justice movement are experts at this. We too often overlook them, but there are so many lessons that you can learn from people in that movement. And I think that we should be paying attention to it and forming relationships with it, and then understand it as a resource to us all. And one way you can come meet people in that movement who will be is that a number of them will be attending a conference June 19 through 22 that my organization, the 22nd Century Initiative, is hosting in Atlanta. And it's a national conference and everybody should come. We'll have a great time, hopefully. And, there's a lot to learn because many, many people will be coming together from here and around a couple places around the world. So you can find out more about it at 22ci.org.
Thanks so much, Scott. And I do, yes, there's no question that fascism is a eugenic movement, first and foremost. And I think it's really important for folks to not only be learning from disabled folks' networks and communities, but to be clearly and solidly in solidarity. And ableism is definitely a form of criminalization that we want to be combating. I'm going to close by asking Sean to drop in the chat a little thing that we created at Interrupting Criminalization. It was, as so many things are at IC, a brainchild of Mariam Kaba's that I took and ran with and consulted with many folks in making, but it's called Block and Build, but Make It Abolitionist. So it's basically making sure that as we are fighting fascism and authoritarianism, that we are addressing many of the issues that we talked about tonight and more, and that we're finding ways of building power that don't reproduce power over, but actually create power with and can bring us to the future we want, not just going back to the carceral past that we had that was slightly less bad than the current conditions. So Sean will be driving it in the chat. If you want to learn more about it, hit us up at Interrupting Criminalization. I also have a Resisting Criminalization help desk that you can call if you want to talk through how to use it in your organization. And we will be gathering folks to talk about how they're practicing what's in it throughout the year. So with that, I will just thank all of our incredible panelists. I hope that all of you in your living rooms are cheering, whooping, and hollering, and grateful for this moment of kind of grounding and collective sense making. I know I am grateful to everyone here, to Haymarket Books for hosting, to Funders for Justice and the Democratizing Justice Initiative for co-sponsoring, and to most of all, to all of you for being here. So looking forward to continuing to fight criminalization as we resist authoritarianism and fascism together in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. Thanks, everyone.